Mom, for her part, felt that Lucy Jo was woefully uninformed. When Mom mentioned Jackson Pollock once, Lucy Jo said that she had Polish blood and therefore didn't appreciate Mom using derogatory names for Polish people. Mom had the same problem she'd had in Battle Mountain with organizing her paperwork and disciplining her students. At least one morning a week, she'd throw a tantrum and refuse to go to work, and Lori, Brian, and I would have to get her collected and down to the street where Lucy Jo waited with a scowl, blue smoke chugging up out of the dart's rusted-through tailpipe. But at least we had money. While I'd been bringing in a little extra cash babysitting, Brian was cutting other people's weeds, and Lori had a paper route. It didn't add up to much. Now Mom got paid about $700 a month, and the first time I saw her gray-green paycheck with its detachable stub and automated signatures, I thought our troubles were over. On paydays, Mom took us kids down to the big bank across from the courthouse to cash the check. After the cashier gave her the money, Mom went into a corner of the bank and stuffed it into a sock she'd safety pinned into her bra. Then we all scurried down around to the power company and the water authority and the landlord, paying off our bills with 10s and 20s. The clerks averted their eyes as Mom fished the sock out of her bra, explaining to everyone within earshot that this was her way of making sure she was never pickpocketed. Mom also bought some electric heaters and a refrigerator on layaway, and we'd go to the appliance store and put down a few dollars every month, figuring they'd be ours by winter time. Mom always had at least one extravagance on layaway, something we really didn't need, a tasseled silk throw or a cut crystal vase, because she said the surest way to feel rich was to invest in quality non-essentials. After that, we'd go to the grocery store at the bottom of the hill and stock up on staples such as beans and rice, powdered milk, and canned goods. Mom always bought the dented cans, even though they weren't marked down, because she said they needed to be loved too. At home, we'd empty Mom's purse onto the sofa bed and count the remaining money. There'd be hundreds of dollars, more than enough to cover our expenses until the end of the month, I thought. But month after month, the money would disappear before the next paycheck arrived, and once more I'd find myself rooting the garbage at school for food. Toward the end of one month that fall, Mom announced that we had only $1 for dinner. That was enough to buy 1 gallon of Neapolitan ice cream, which she said was not only delicious, but had lots of calcium and would be good for our bones. We brought the ice cream home, and Brian pulled apart the carton and cut the block into 5 even slices. I called dibs on the first choice. Mom told us to savor it because we had no money for dinner the next night. Mom, what happened to it all? I asked as we ate our ice cream slices. Gone, 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 she said. It's all gone. But where? Lori asked. I've got a house full of kids and a husband who soaks up booze like a sponge, Mom said. Making ends meet is harder than you think. It couldn't be that hard, I thought. Other moms did it. I tried quizzing her. Was she spending the money for herself? Was she giving it to Dad? Was Dad stealing it? Or did we go through it quickly? I couldn't get an answer. Give us the money, I said. We'll work out a budget and stick to it. Easy for you to say, Mom replied. Lori and I did work out a budget, and we included a generous allowance for Mom to cover luxuries such as extra-large Hershey bars and cut crystal vases. If we kept to our budget, we believed we could afford new clothes and shoes and coats and buy a ton of coal at the cheaper off-season price. Eventually, we could install insulation, run a water pipe into the house, and maybe even add a water heater. But Mom never turned the money over to us. So even though she had a steady job, we were living pretty much like we had before. I'd started 7th grade that fall, which meant attending Welch High School. It was a big school near the top of a hill, looking down on the town with a steep road leading up. Kids were bussed in from way up in the hollows and from coal camps such as Davie and Hemphill that were too small to have their own high school. Some of the kids looked as poor as me, with home-cut hair and holes in the toes of their shoes. I found it a lot easier to fit in than at Welch Elementary. Denisha Hewitt was there, too. That summer morning I'd spent with Denisha at the public pool was the happiest time I'd had in Welch, but she never invited me back. Even though it was a public pool, I didn't feel like I could go to the free swim unless I had an invitation from her. I saw her again only when school started, and neither of us ever mentioned that day at the pool. I guess we both knew that given the way people in Welch thought about mixing, it would be too weird for us to try to be close friends. During lunch, Denisha hung out with the other black kids, but we had a study hall together and passed notes to each other there. By the time she got to Welch High, Denisha had changed. The spark had gone out of her. She started drinking malt ale. During school, she'd fill a soda can with Mad Dog 2020 and carry it right into class. I tried to find out what was wrong, but all I could pry from her was that her mother's new boyfriend had moved in with them and the fit was a little tight. One day, just before Christmas, Denisha passed me a note instead of call asking for girls' names that began with D. I wrote down as many as I could think of: Diane, Donna, Dora, Dreama, Deandra, and then I wrote Y. She passed a note back saying, I think I'm pregnant. After Christmas, Denisha did not return to school. When a month had gone by, I walked around the mountain to her house and knocked at the door. A man opened it and stared at me. He had skin like an iron skillet and nicotine yellow eyes. He left the storm door shut, so I had to speak through the screen. Is Denisha home? I asked. Why do you want to know? I want to see her. She don't want to see you, he said, and shut the door. I saw Denisha around town once or twice after that. We waved but never spoke again. Later, we all learned she'd been arrested for stabbing her mother's boyfriend to death. The other girls talked endlessly among themselves about who still had their chair and how far they would let their boyfriend go. The world seemed divided into girls with boyfriends and girls without them. It was the distinction that mattered the most, practically the only one that did matter. But I knew that boys were dangerous. They said they loved you, but they were always after something. Even though I didn't trust boys, I sure did wish one would show me some interest in me. Kenny Hall, the old guy down the street who was still pining away for me, didn't count. If any boy was interested in me, I wondered if I'd have the wherewithal to tell him, when he tried to go too far, that I was not that kind of girl. But the truth was, I didn't need to worry about much fending off advances, seeing as Ernie Goat had told me on every available occasion, I was pork chop ugly. And by that, he meant so ugly that if I wanted a dog to play with me, I'd have to tie a pork chop around my neck. I had what Mom called distinctive looks. That was one way of putting it. I was nearly 6 feet tall, pale as a frog's underbelly, and had bright red hair. My elbows were like flying wedges, and my knees like tea saucers. But my most prominent feature, my worst, was my teeth. They weren't rotten or crooked. In fact, they were pretty big, healthy things, but they stuck straight out. The top row thrust forward so enthusiastically that I had trouble closing my mouth completely. And I was always stretching my upper lip to try to cover them. When I laughed, I put my hand over my mouth. Lori told me that I had an exaggerated view of how bad my teeth looked. They're just a little bucked, she'd say. They have a certain Pippi Longstocking charm, Mom told me. My overbite gave my face character. Brian said they'd come in handy if I ever needed to eat an apple through the knothole in a fence. What I needed, I knew, was braces. Every time I looked in the mirror, I longed for what the other kids called a barbed wire mouth. Mom and Dad had no money for braces, of course. None of us kids had ever been to the dentist. But since I'd been babysitting and doing other kids' homework for cash, I resolved to save up until I could afford braces myself. I had no idea how much they cost, so I approached the only girl in my class who wore braces, and after complimenting her orthodontia, casually asked how much it had set her folks back. And she said $1,200. I almost fell over. I was getting $1 an hour to babysit. I usually worked 5 or 6 hours a week, which meant that if I saved every penny I earned, it would take about 4 years to raise the money. I decided to make my own braces. I went to the library and asked for a book on orthodontia. The librarian looked at me kind of funny and said she didn't have one, so I realized I have to figure things out as I went along. The process involved some experimentation and several false starts. At first, I simply used a rubber band. Before going to bed, I'd stretch it all the way around the entire set of my upper teeth. The rubber band was small but thick and had a good tight fit, but it pressed down uncomfortably on my tongue, and sometimes it would pop off during the night, and I'd wake up choking on it. Usually, however, it stayed on all night, and in the morning my gums would be sore from the pressure on my teeth. That seemed like a promising sign, but I began to worry that instead of pushing my front teeth in, the rubber band might be pulling my back teeth forward. So I got some large rubber bands and wore them around my whole head, pressing against my front teeth. The problem with this technique was that the rubber bands were tight. They had to be to work. So I'd wake up with headaches and deep red marks where the rubber bands had dug into the sides of my face. I needed more advanced technology. I bent a metal coat hanger into a horseshoe shape to fit the back of my head. Then I curled the two ends outward so that when the coat hanger was around my head, the ends angled away from my face and formed hooks to hold the rubber band in place. When I tried it on, the coat hanger dug into the back of my skull, so I used a Kotex sanitary napkin for padding. The contraption worked perfectly, except that I had to sleep flat on my back, which I always had trouble doing, especially when it was cold. I liked to snuggle down into the blankets. Also, the rubber band still popped off in the middle of the night. Another drawback was that the device took a lot of time to put on properly. I'd wait until it was dark so no one else would see it. One night I was lying in my bunk wearing my elaborate coat hanger braces when the bedroom door opened. I could make out a dim figure in the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, but because I had my braces on, it came out sounding like "Poof." "It's your old man," Dad said. "What's with the mumbling?" He came over to my bunk, held up his Zippo and flicked it. A flame shot up. "What Sam Hill's that on your head?" I said. "Your what?" I took off the contraption and explained to Dad that because my front teeth stuck out so badly I needed braces. But they cost $1,200, so I had made my own. "Put them back on," Dad said. He studied my handiwork intently and then nodded. "Those braces are a goddamn feat of engineering genius. You take after your old man." He took my chin and pulled my mouth open. "And I think they're, by God, working." That year I started working for the school newspaper, the Maroon Wave. I wanted to join some club or group or organization where I could feel I belonged, where people wouldn't move away if I sat down next to them. I was a good runner, and I thought of going out for the track team, but you had to pay for your uniform, and Mom said we couldn't afford it. You didn't have to buy a uniform or musical instrument or pay any dues to work on the Wave. Miss Jeanette Bivens, one of the high school English teachers who was the Wave's faculty advisor. She was a quiet, precise woman who had been at Welch High School so long she had also been Dad's English teacher. She was the first person in his life, he once told me, who showed any faith in him. She thought he was a talented writer and had encouraged him to submit a 24-line poem called Summer Storm to a statewide poetry competition. When it won first prize, one of Dad's other teachers wondered aloud if the son of two low-life alcoholics like Ted and Irma Walls could have written it himself. Dad was so insulted that he walked out of school. It was Miss Bivens who convinced him to return and earn his diploma, telling him he had what it took to be somebody. Dad had named me after her. Mom suggested adding the second N to make it more elegant in French. Miss Bivens told me that, as far as she could remember, I was the only 7th grader who'd ever worked for the Wave. I started out as a proofreader. On winter evenings, instead of huddling around the stove at 93 Little Hobart Street, I'd go down to the warm, dry offices of the Welch Daily News, where the Maroon Wave was typeset, laid out and printed. I loved the newsroom's purposeful atmosphere. Teletype machines clattered against the wall as spools of paper carrying news from around the world piled up on the floor. Banks of fluorescent lights hung down 18 inches above the slanted glass-topped desks, where men wearing green eye shades conferred over stacks of copy and photographs. I'd take the Wave galleys and sit at one of the desks, my back firm, a pencil behind my ear, studying the pages for typos. The years I'd spent helping Mom check spelling on her students' homework had given me lots of practice for this line of work. I'd make corrections with a light blue felt marker that couldn't be picked up by the camera that photographed the pages for printing. The typesetters would retype the lines I'd corrected and print them out. I'd run the corrected lines through the hot wax machine that made the backside sticky, then cut out the lines with an X-Acto knife and fit them over the original lines. I tried to remain inconspicuous in the newsroom, but one of the typesetters, a crabbed, chain-smoking, and we'll stop there.